Welcome to session 2 in the series called Whole. Today we're going to talk about God and the way you view God, your paradigm of the way you see Him. It's really important that you see God as He declares Himself to us, because when we see God in an improper way, it hinders us from being able to receive or put our trust and believe in maybe what He wants to do within our lives. I want to share just my personal story of my engagement with God. I was raised as a Catholic, and there's a lot of good heritage in my Catholic upbringing about God and maybe His design for humanity. But there's a lot of things that, from my perspective, are a little off kilter about my relationship with God. I remember going to church as a young boy, and it really felt like God was far away, and when He was a part of my life, or I let Him be a part, He was very judgmental, and I had all these rules and regulations and laws that I had to abide by, and it didn't stir me in my heart to maybe really want to be close to Him. As a matter of fact, I kind of, in my heart, kind of pushed Him away. And I was raised, my mother had a conversion experience when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and began to really kind of show a love for God that I have never seen before. And she began to teach us and talk to us about God in maybe a more meaningful way, but it was still quite abstract for me. And at the age of 12, I committed my heart to God, and I wanted to know Him better. But I really, honestly, from 12 to about 18, my commitment or my understanding of God's love to me and my relationship with God was still driven by what I had known in that paradigm as a young kid, that God was judging me, and though He'd forgiven me, He still was kind of a judging God, and I hadn't built a really healthy relationship with Him. But I remember distinctly, I was just got out of Bible college, was just starting with a New Life Drama Company, and I was in this hotel room with some other people, and we were having to get up really early the next morning, and one of the guys said, "I'm going to go first and get up and be the first one to take a shower." So I was laying in the bed, and this guy gets in the shower, and he begins to worship God in the shower. And I remember just sitting there, kind of my peak interest of, what is this guy doing? My mom told me to worship God, but it was, again, kind of a parental demand of how I should worship God. But I heard this young man about my age just singing praises to God, and something in me said, man, it sounds to me like he's connecting to God in a way that I don't connect with God. I don't see God that way, but there was a yearning in my heart to say, what, I want to know God in a different way. And it wasn't long after he got out of the shower and it was my turn to go in the shower that I went in that shower, and I began a journey of a loving, caring relationship with God that began to change me as my paradigm and perspective of God began to change. I began to see God as a loving, caring, benevolent God that was wanting to be a part of my life, and it has impacted me from that day till today.
All of us have been skewed in how we relate to God and our perception of how He relates to us. I, like Billy, was raised in a very strict church, except it wasn't Catholic, it was actually Pentecostal. And I didn't feel like God was far away from me. They actually do a really good job of letting you know that God's presence is very near you. But they also had a lot of legalism involved. So, for example, women couldn't cut their hair, couldn't wear makeup or jewelry or pants or shorts. As you can tell, I've been delivered. But it was still very legalistic and very outward focused. So that gave me a sense that God was near, but He was also ready to judge me at any second. And so I never could live up to that standard. If I wanted God near me, but I had to be perfect, I always seemed to fall short of that standard. And so I turned away from God because I couldn't relate to Him, because He was constantly judging me in my paradigm, in the way that I saw Him viewing me and me viewing Him. And so this session, we really want to talk about, we all have those slants of how we view God, how He relates to us, but there is a correct slant. There is a biblical view that we can see of how we should relate to God and how He desires to relate to us. There's actually two relationships that we as humans can really identify with that we see in Scripture of how God, both Old Testament and New Testament, wanted to relate to His people. One was that of a father or a parent to a child, and the other one was that of a husband to a wife, a marriage relationship. And so out of these two relationships, we see that the parental role is God's great love towards us, but also the need for Him to instruct us, guide us, and discipline us. And then we see in the marriage relationship His great love and sacrifice towards us, and how He wants to have an intimate relationship with us. That's so foreign to so many Christians today and non-Christians alike. I have a family member who was just invited to participate in a vacation Bible school, and she was excited to tell me that she was considering participating, and she is a Christian, but this was a new stretch for her, stepping out and serving at a vacation Bible school. But then she said to me, but they wanted me to communicate to the children to understand that God was always with them, and if they ever needed Him, they could just call on Him. And she had reservation about teaching because she wasn't sure that she fully believed that. Now, I think there's a lot of Christians out there, and maybe you watching this video right now, who go, I don't relate to God in that way. And so we're asking you to open up your heart to see what Scripture says and what Jesus taught about a proper God view. We see in the story of Hosea, the Israelites were messing up. In fact, God used this marriage analogy to say that He was making a covenant with Israel and that He would be their husband and they His bride. And we see Israel cheating on God, basically. They were committing adultery. Everything God asked them not to do, they were doing. They were making idols and worshiping other idols. And so God wanted to give them a visual aid. So He says to the prophet of the time, Hosea, I want you to go and I want you to marry a harlot. I want you to go pay 15 shekels, that's what he paid, for a harlot. And I want you to take her in as your wife, and I want you to be faithful to her. And so Hosea does this. He goes, he pays 15 shekels for a harlot and says, you are to no longer wander and be with other men. I am calling you into covenant with me, and I also will be in covenant with you. And we see this type and shadow of God to His people and Hosea the prophet to this harlot. And he loved her. They had a child together. They had a few children together. But then the harlot began to wander back to her sin nature, if you will. And she started going out with other men and being unfaithful in the same way that Israel was. And she got to a point that she eventually left Hosea completely and went back to her old lifestyle. And then time went by. I'm sure her body got worn out, as all of ours do with age. And she was now put on a slavery block. No one wanted her for her body anymore. She was just only good to be a slave. And God spoke to Hosea and He said, I want you to go and I want you to buy her back and make her your own again. Regardless of what the world views her like, she's still my beloved and I want you to marry her. The Lord spoke to Hosea and said, I want you to say this to Gomer, that you will no longer call me master, but you will call me husband. You see, the first time that Gomer came into a relationship with Hosea, she was thinking he just did it out of obligation because God told him, not recognizing how much he really loved her. And so many people have that law, rules-based relationship with God. And I believe that's the message in the heart of God for you in this session, that you will no longer call me master, but you will call me husband. In other words, God's calling you not into an employee-employer relationship, but to a husband and a lover relationship where He's committed to intimacy with you and you also with Him. So would you consider opening up your heart and your mind just to see God from a different view than perhaps you do even now, and talk about what that looks like?
You know, in Scripture, Jesus actually invited the Jews of the time. They always had an abstract view of God or a distant view of God, and Jesus actually brought the term Father back into play and said, you know what, I don't want you to see Him as a distant God. I want you to see Him as a God that He used the term Abba Father, that you would call Him almost like this daddy God. That's an informal way of communicating to Father, that you say daddy, just a different way to say it. But when you hear the term daddy, there's a sense of closeness and intimacy that comes into play. And for you, I hope that you can this week, as you go through and process and ask questions and answer questions and seek, that you'd be able to say in your own heart, instead of God being distant and someone to fear, but you'd be able to say, hey, this is my daddy God. This is a caring, loving Father that I want to be in relationship and I want to spend time with. I hope that your paradigm can shift, and we know that God's going to help you become all that you're supposed to be. He's going to make you whole.